Welcome everyone to this first 2024 episode of the Privacy Espresso series. First of all, Happy New Year to you all. I'm Alessandro Di Mattia, Legal and Executive Officer at PrivacyRules. And today we are going to kick off this series of very quick and short updates that we do together with a member of our alliance, nowadays covering almost 60 countries all over the world, in order to give you insights related to privacy, technologies, and data protection, of course, under the law, but also cybersecurity and crisis communication perspective, as we have experts from these three different types of sectors. And I'm happy to open the first session of today together with Kristen Pennington from our Canadian law firm, McMillan. Kristen is a lawyer and partner of the privacy and data protection group of the firm. That is a full-service business law firm that has been working for a while now with the Privacy Rules, luckily for us as exclusive member for Canada. So first of all, Kristen, thank you very much for finding the time to be with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thanks a lot, and Happy New Year as well to you. Yeah, I know that there are some very recent and interesting news coming from Canada that about changes that have been popping up in the course of December 2023 that are related to generative AI technologies. I heard about the fact that the privacy regulators in Canada have weighed some new developments. So can you provide us a bit of update on which are the latest news from Canada on this matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial privacy authorities co-published in December 2023 a document called the Principles for Responsible, Trustworthy, and Privacy Protective Generative AI Technologies. And that document offers long-awaited guidance regarding generative artificial intelligence, or GenAI, systems in Canada.
Okay, and who are the organization to which those type of principles you're mentioning applied?
So the principles are drafted jointly to apply to organizations that are subject to Canada's public, private, and health sector privacy laws. So fairly broad application. And though the considerations outlined in the principles are framed as recommendations, they will be mandatory for many organizations in order to comply with the privacy laws that apply to them. The principles offer guidance for a number of different organizations, including those that develop, provide, or sell and use Gen AI systems. So some of the principles apply only to developers, others only to providers. Some apply uniquely to users of Gen AI systems. And then there are a number of principles and guidance that apply to organizations that are involved with Gen AI systems in any capacity.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. And concerning Canada specifically, which are the key principles that are of interest, of course, and we should know more about?
Yeah, so it's quite a long document. There are 10 principles that are outlined by the regulators, but then there are a number of different action items sorted under each of those principles. So, an exhaustive summary of all those principles, what isn't possible during our short time together today. But generally, the principles mirror a number of the major concepts that are reflected in Canadian privacy laws. So they address issues like legal authority and consent for the processing of personal information, appropriate uses for of personal information, necessity, openness, and transparency requirements, the principle of accountability, ensuring that individuals have access to their personal information that's used or generated through AI systems, limiting the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information, implementing appropriate safeguards to protect that information, and considering the impact of Gen AI systems on vulnerable groups like children or groups that have historically been subject to bias or discrimination. For me personally, one of the most interesting takeaways from the principles is that Canadian privacy regulators are taking the position that using Gen AI to infer information about an identifiable individual constitutes a collection of that personal
Mhm.
information under privacy laws, and therefore it does require a legal authority, which will in most cases be consent. And then another interesting point for me is that the principles helpfully remind organizations that they have to implement safeguards to protect personal information that's collected or used throughout the life cycle of a Gen AI system. And specifically, that organizations have to consider risks that are particular to Gen AI systems, which the privacy regulators say are prompt injection attacks, model inversion attacks, and jailbreaking. So, a bit of guidance for sort of our cybersecurity colleagues as well.
That sounds great, and it seems that more or less those principles are quite aligned to the previous privacy-related laws. So sounds like a good news for companies that were already, keep peace with them. But of course, as you rightly mentioned, there are for sure some changes or different approaches that are required given the different type of technology that is involved in this case. So going more into the practical side of this discussion, what should organization do to be compliant with those principles into practice?
Yeah, so organizations that develop, provide, or use Gen AI systems should conduct thorough assessments of both current and future Gen AI systems and use cases to ensure compliance with the principles and, of course, with Canadian privacy laws more broadly. So that could take the form, for example, of a privacy impact assessment or an algorithmic assessment, really going through with a fine tooth comb whether what you're intending to do with the system that you're developing or offering or using will comply with these principles. It's also going to be important for organizations to engage in continuous monitoring and updating of those Gen AI systems to address any new sort of emerging privacy concerns or biases that may arise throughout the life cycle of a system. Organizations will also need to develop and implement fairly robust data governance policies and procedures that align with the requirements of the principles and with Canadian privacy laws. And I think there it's going to be really important to conduct role specific training for personnel to ensure that they understand their responsibilities with respect to Gen AI, whether they're involved in its development or, selling or marketing Gen AI or even using Gen AI during the course of their duties and responsibilities for your organization. And finally, I think it goes without saying that organizations are going to have to be nimble. The principles are a starting point, but as Gen AI technologies continue to develop and as there are further laws and more regulatory guidance that are implemented and released, your policies and your practices and even the way you design Gen AI systems is going to have to be adjusted accordingly. So I think it's really important for organizations to develop relationships with legal experts in the jurisdictions where they're operating to ensure that they're best positioned to receive up to date guidance in a field that's obviously evolving quite rapidly.
Absolutely, absolutely. Those sounds as very good practical tips. In particular, I let me echo you on the need for training and flexibility as well. Because whenever we deal with technologies, what we have learned is that there is ever changing both technologies and laws related. So it's necessary to have experts that are specialized in the sector to support you every time there is something new and that knows what we are talking about, because the implications behind those technologies can not be that clear to someone that is not that familiar with those topics. In this
Absolutely.
regard, it's interesting to see how the Canadian authority has moved, in particular, rushing at the end of 2023. So my next question for you would be why? What has been pushing the authority there in doing this, in acting this way?
Well, obviously, Gen AI is very newsworthy. Like its ability to generate different outputs based on users' prompts is super tempting. Organizations across a variety of industries are understandably very keen to leverage this powerful technology and to innovate in this space. So, I think organizations have really been looking for more concrete guidance to understand how Gen AI systems map onto Canada's existing privacy laws and regulatory guidance. So I think, the regulators did need to step up and at the very least provide some form of guidance or input on how current laws do apply to these systems so that organizations have a bit more comfort in how to go about developing and offering and using these systems. But the release of the principles also, it's not the first step that's been taken. It reflects really a global movement calling for the safe and responsible development and use of AI. So, for example, Canada had already released a voluntary code of conduct on the responsible development and management of advanced Gen AI systems. So, the principles really add another layer to the guidance that has already been released by the Canadian government. And finally, I think it's important to remember that there is significant legislative reform, particularly regarding interprovincial and international trade and commerce in AI systems, that may be on the horizon in Canada. So, Bill C-27 is still being debated before the Canadian House of Commons. And if it's passed, it would, at least in its current form, introduce the AIDA, or the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. So the principles, I think, in some respects, are sort of a stopgap measure to say, here's the law as it currently stands in Canada. Here's how the regulators view that law as applying to Gen AI systems. But again, we all do need to be nimble and recognize that this is developing rapidly, and there may be more change and more guidance on the horizon very shortly.
Great. Thanks a lot. And this is, again, super useful, I think, to everyone listening to us. And of course, we can see how those principles can be perceived also as guidelines for anyone that can be of use, because, of course, they integrate inputs from all over the world where we are looking and witnessing, many changes. In particular, in the course of the last year, one other thing I totally align with you is the fact that in many cases we have seen usage of artificial intelligence without enough knowledge on the effect, in particular on the privacy perspective. So let's not forget about privacy by design, and the fact that you need to know what you are going to do with those data and how you are going to use them when applying them into artificial intelligence. Because, as said, you may not expect some events that will happen, and you may lose control, in particular, of those data after, if you are not clear on what you're going to do with them. So
Absolutely.
definitely one more reason to be supported by experts. Just one last question to support again our listeners is, where can we, me as well, find more information about those principles?
So I really recommend that, any organization that's involved in the Gen AI space, whether you're a developer, you're providing or marketing these systems, or you're using these systems, or your personnel may be using these systems, should really give the principles, a read through in full. There's a lot of information there, a lot of important guidance to help ensure that what you're doing complies with Canadian privacy legislation and regulators' expectations in this respect. So well worth a read in their entirety. McMillan has also drafted a short article summarizing some of the key principles, and that is available on our website. So we will include a link with this video if you'd like to read a bit more about the principles.
Perfect, and that's great. Thanks a lot for that. Looking forward to share those links with our followers, that I thank as well. I would also like to inform you all that Privacy Rules has moved this Espresso series not just as a video series on YouTube and LinkedIn, but also as a true, let's say, or pure podcast on Spotify and other channels. We will also link those other platforms to this video of today. I would like to thank our audience, that I also invite to send us comment and questions that we can use, to answer the question directly, or also for further materials from our side. And Happy New Year once more. Thanks a lot, and looking forward to meeting you again very soon with updates on these and many other matters. Kristen, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll talk to you soon.